Oh, hello. Welcome to the 2013 Hundie Challenge. Today we're going to be discussing Sex and the Furry by Will I Am. Dee-doo-dee-doo-doo, dee-doo-dee-doo-dee-doo-dee-doo-doo, dee-doo-dee-doo-doo, dee-doo-dee-doo-dee-doo-doo-doo. If you'd asked me about it last week, I'd have told you that this was the worst book I'd ever read. However, right after reading The Sound and the Fury, I started reading Finnegan's Wake, so Faulkner gets a reprieve. I have several big issues with the structure of this book. The first big issue, and none of these taken alone would be enough to ruin the book entirely, but all of them combine to make it just an unreadable mess. So the first problem is this book, in the copy that I have, is 400 pages long, and it's got 4 chapters. So that's 100 pages per chapter. And like I said, that alone is not necessarily a deal breaker. I suppose I could read a 100-page chapter. By the way, that's with no section breaks, no, 3 little asterisks, nothing. Just 100 pages straight. I think I maybe could handle a 100-page chapter if it wasn't for the second big issue that I have with the structure of this book, which is the unreliable narrators. So there's 3 narrators, and then the 4th chapter is kind of an omniscient view. The first narrator is Benji Compson, who suffers from some kind of mental retardation. And in Benji's chapter, which, by the way, each chapter is titled with a date. So Benji's chapter is April 7th, 1928. However, since Benji has some kind of issues, they call him an idiot or an imbecile. I think we would call him intellectually disabled or something today. But in any case, he doesn't live time the way we live time. So in his chapter, which is supposed to be dated April 28th, he actually goes back and forth between 4 different timelines. And not just like, oh, well, here's a little section break, and now here's a different timeline. In the middle of sentences, in the middle of paragraphs, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. Apparently, Faulkner's original intention was to write this chapter in 4 different inks, so you would know, even if it was the middle of a sentence, that Benji was, mixing up what time frame he was living in, because you would see it go from red ink to blue ink. However, that just never happened. Or anyway, when it happened 100 years later or 90 years later, that was not the copy that I got. So there are hundreds and thousands of copies of The Sound and the Fury that don't have this weird little ink plan that Faulkner came up with. And my problem with that, and I'm only focusing on Benji right now. I've got problems with the other chapters too. But the problem with that is it's so opaque that you realize that you needed some kind of a gimmick for people to be able to understand it, and you still went ahead and wrote it. I don't mind when there's temporal changes in a book, because it's usually so well written that you can pick up, as you go along, what time frame it is. You can pick it up just from context clues, if nothing else, on a really well-written book. And in this, because of Benji's condition, it's impossible to follow. So the whole first 100 pages may as well not have been written, because it's totally incomprehensible. The second 100 pages, which is from Quentin's perspective. Now, I'll get into this in a minute, but anyway, it's Quentin the man. I know that sounds like a weird thing to say, but I'll get into that. That's another one of my big structural problems, but I'll get into that in a minute. Quentin the elder, Quentin the male, suffers from some kind of mental illness. I think he's bipolar. I don't. Again, he's not diagnosed in the context of the book, nor would they have had these terms at that time. But he's got some kind of severe mental illness, and his entire chapter, again, another 100 pages, give or take, is just the nonsensical ramblings of an insane person. Which, again, I would probably be okay with that if the chapters weren't 100 pages. So, you have a choice here, Faulkner, to make your work not so dense and unreadable. Either give me, 10-page chapters where I'll suffer through Benji and Quentin talking in this fashion. Or write your 100-page chapters and don't write them with these unreliable narrators. Now, the third and the fourth chapter aren't so bad, but nevertheless, Jason Compson is just a reprehensible human being who I have absolutely no interest in and no respect for, which is the third chapter. And then the fourth chapter is kind of an omniscient narrator. And the third and the fourth chapter is the only time when things really start to happen that you understand. So the whole first half of the book could have not happened, except as a experiment in prose, I guess. And now I alluded to this. A third big problem that I have with the structure of this is the characters. So there's two characters named Jason, which I guess is okay. One's the father, one's the son. But then there's also two characters named Quentin. One is Quentin, who is the uncle of the female Quentin and is also implied to be the father from an incestuous relationship, but we know he's the uncle. And so they named the daughter / niece also Quentin, which is a male's name, but they just named her Quentin. So there's a male Quentin, there's a female Quentin. There's Jason the elder, Jason the younger. And when you're reading Benji's chapter, it's all just Jason and Quentin and he and she. And reading the whole chapter, you can't figure out whether Quentin's a boy or a girl. Oh, because it turns out that there's two of them. And so how could I possibly know which one he's talking about? It's so opaque. It's virtually incomprehensible. The fourth big issue that I have with the structure of this, and again, like I said, any one of these is okay on its own, but taken all together, they just make for a slog of a read. But the fourth problem I have with this is the way that Faulkner shows how the dialect of the characters goes forward, because he's not satisfied to just have the poor southern black dialect be spoken. He feels the need to show that the way it's written in the prose. So instead of going, G-O-I-N-G, it's gwine, G-W-I-N-E, because that's the way that it's pronounced. I'm gwine down to the fair instead of I'm going down to the fair. Well, you know what? You could take any one of these sentences without replacing the T-H-E with duh, D-E, and they would still work fine because of the syntax. The entire dialect comes across in the syntax, but for some reason, the dialect has to be expressed in the way that he writes the words, which it's always something that has irritated me when authors feel the need to do that. But again, like I said, that's something that's so minor that I could have forgiven it if I hadn't been reading that in the middle of a 100-page chapter from the perspective of an unreliable narrator who is talking about four people with two names. In any case, it's one of the most opaque books I've ever read, and there's no real payoff. There's hardly a plot. If I thought that, I kept thinking, I'm like, well, maybe now that I've gotten through the first 200 pages, maybe now something will start happening and the plot will all pay off, and it never really does. The thing that bothers me most about it is, what really nags me about it, is that I sort of think that this was written as a practical joke, because if you look at the title, The Sound and the Fury, the next line, of course, being from the Shakespeare, which is signifying nothing. So The Sound and the Fury signifies nothing, and I hate the concept that Faulkner may have written this entire book just as a big practical joke. To be, oh, it's The Sound and the Fury, and it's utterly meaningless, as I told you in the title. At least he didn't beat you over the head with the title like they did in Brave New World, when they had the poor kid who did nothing but read Shakespeare and say Brave New World 100 times a chapter. But just, I assume that the natural interpretation of that is that Benji's constantly screaming, but his sound and his fury signifies nothing. But they totally prove that wrong in the first chapter. Right away, you know that Benji understands what's going on. So his sound and his fury doesn't actually signify nothing. So I sort of think that the title of the book refers to the content of the book as meaningless. So, long story short, don't waste your time, only for aficionados. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.